Good morning. Hi, Kari. I'm glad that you could join me this morning. I'm going to go ahead and get started since I think most people will be watching the recording. Um, we are going to begin with the notes that were entitled Causes of World War II. So if you printed those notes, please get those out and ready to go. And since I have a lot to cover today, I'm going to jump right in. And I'm sorry, I have allergies today. I'm not like sick, but I do sound very stuffy. So, all right. So let's talk about the causes of World War II. We have had two discussions now where I have pointed out things that we're setting the stage for a war to happen, and we're going to see now how we can connect those dots. But just a little bit of an intro here. World War I is also referred to as the Great War. It was fought from July 14th to November 1918. This war was the first man-made major catastrophe with so many deaths in the 20th century. 17 million people were killed. So it's the deadliest war of all time. It's also referred to as the war in the trenches. There's just a picture here of what it was like on the front line for World War I. Let me go here. I am going to pause my recording and pause this just for a second, Kari. I'm going to go get a tissue. All right, let me get back to my screen here and let's talk about the whys. What caused this major world war that killed actually over 17 million people? So there was no single one event. That's why, as we've gone over our notes the past couple of weeks, I keep pointing out things that this kind of thing is going to, what is leading to the world war. It was a very complicated and intertwined chain of events that involved many countries. This led to the outbreak of fighting and into three groups that you could put countries in during this war. The Central Powers, which were Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire. There were the Central Powers, the Allied Powers, which you can think of England and France as those leaders, in Italy. And then the neutral countries, which are countries who just really wanted to stay out of it. And you can see those in yellow: Spain, Norway, Sweden, etc. Okay, so what are our main causes? We're going to use this acronym called MAIN because each of these issues contributed to the outbreak of war. We've talked over and over again about the rise of militarism, which is simply put that countries really began to focus on building up their militaries. The alliances, we talked about that last week, basically meaning they had written contracts with other countries that they were their friends or their allies in peace and in wartime. So if someone were to attack one country and that country had a friend, that friend was to be considered attacked as well because they were one. They had an agreement that they would stand together. Imperialism, which we talked about at length, this going in and taking over other countries and using them for resources, which also contributed to having the ability for weapons, for militarism. And then nationalism, as borders were drawn, ethnicities were not always recognized. Therefore, people were really bitter and angry about what borders they were living within because they didn't associate those with what they were nationally. Nationalism is just this strong sense of pride of what country you are from and what ethnicity you are. Okay, so let's talk about them at length. I'm going to go through this quickly since most of you will be watching a recording and have the ability to stop it to take notes. So many countries get a lot of military strength at this time. France and Germany actually double the size of their armies. Great Britain and Germany have the world's largest and most powerful navies. So they dominate the seas with their military. Industrialization allowed countries to manufacture more powerful weapons, and the military becomes a focal point, a very high priority of what they're going to spend their money on as countries or their economy. And so then politicians are constantly sharing with the people this desire to build up the military and the reasons why. Okay, so these alliances, these start before the war. These are not alliances that came about because it's war and you picked a side. They're actually really the root cause of why it was a world war. So it's a mutual defense agreement that if one country is attacked, we will be right there to help you. Italy, Austria-Hungary, and Germany have the Triple Alliance. France, Great Britain, and Russia are the Triple Entente. Russia and Serbia also have this separate alliance, which we'll see is super important here in just a minute. European countries hope that these alliances are going to keep other countries from attacking one another, and that peace would be maintained. So let me see if I can get this to play. Maybe. Okay, I'm going to play this for just a minute. Okay, Logan or Kari, can either one of you just send me a message or hands up? Can you hear this recording or do I just need to send the link? Can you hear?
I can't hear it.
Okay. Yeah, I had a feeling. I don't understand why it's like that. So I will copy this link for you because this is a really good, whoops, it's a really good explanation of why these alliances were so important. So now I just have to figure out how to get out of this link. Let me go back here. Go back to my PowerPoint. Darn, there's some really good videos embedded in this PowerPoint, so I'll just have to share the whole thing with y'all. So hopefully you'll take the time to watch them. It'll help you understand a lot more of why these alliances really contributed to the World War. All right, so now get back to these causes. The next one was imperialism, which we focused an entire lesson on last week. When a country increases its power and wealth by acquiring new lands under its control. We talked about the imperialism that occurred of carving up almost the entire continent of Africa, pretty much everything other than the country of Ethiopia was just carved and distributed by more powerful countries. France, Great Britain, they created huge empires worldwide. And we talked about how Great Britain actually was so large that there was no time of day that the sun wasn't shining somewhere. on the British Empire. So Germany and Russia also want to begin building their empires because countries are becoming very rich from the natural resources that they are able to extract from their colonies. They were getting these lands as well as a very inexpensive labor force of the local people as they took over. They were getting diamonds, gold, silver, and we even mentioned last week that they were getting these getting rubber for all of these new types of products that were being developed because of the age of industrialization. So this is just an example of, again, how much Africa was carved up and distributed from 1880 to 1930. This was an intense competition, which contributes to conflict. So I already said this. This is kind of a review of last week. Okay, so let's talk about nationalism. That is just your strong sense of pride for your nation or your ethnic group, people who share a common cultural background. So a lot of times we will see regions of a country that have different ethnicities that live in them. For example, in Eastern Europe, there's a group of people still referred to as the Gypsies. That is people who have a common cultural background. They're not all blood related, but they identify as that. And so the Slavs were an ethnic group in Eastern Europe that had a very strong national identity. And they, this concept of one national identity being superior to other national identities really begins to form conflict at this time. So nationalism is really high in Serbia. That's highlighted there in green. It's just south of that huge Austria-Hungary Empire. Okay, so when I mentioned about the borders and borders not respecting these ethnicities of people who wanted their ethnicity to have its own country. So if you look at Bosnia, it's located in the southern part of the Austria-Hungary Empire. A lot of Slavs live here and in Serbia. They want their own country that is not part of the Austria-Hungary Empire. They want the freedom of the Bosnians too. Now, this has even gone into recent history. So we'll touch back at this again when we get into really modern history in a few weeks. So these nationalistic feelings in connection with all those other world happenings that were going on sparked the World War. So we refer to this as the powder keg of Europe, meaning that the situation that is there, I'm sorry I'm moving around, but my dog keeps running in and out. The situation that exists over there is that Serbia is not happy that the Slavs do not have their own country and that the Bosnians do not have their own country. And they do not want to be part of the Austria-Hungary Empire. And they have this friend that has connected with them with an alliance in Russia. So in June of 1914, the Archduke Ferdinand, he is the heir to the Austria-Hungary throne. That's that huge empire. So he went to visit a city in Bosnia, or the former Bosnian region, Sarajevo. Now, Bosnians, remember, they want to be independent from this empire as well. So Gavrilo Princip, he's a nationalist. He's in a group, I think it was referred, it's called the Black Hand. So he actually finds all this information out that where the Archduke and his wife are going to be. He ends up shooting both the Archduke and his wife and killing them. So we instantly have an issue here that's going to pull into play all of these alliances. So the Austria-Hungary believed that the assassination was organized by the whole Serbian government, not just one man who is in a terrorist group. So 1 month after, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. So let me step back a minute because it's not in this notes, and I'll say this very briefly. They began by making demands of Serbia to prevent war, and they made really outlandish demands. And Serbia actually was able to meet every one of those demands except for one. So because of that, because they really wanted to go to war, they went ahead and declared war anyway. Well, Serbia has a friend, Russia, and Russia instantly mobilizes for war to help defend their friend. France also has an alliance with Russia. Well, Germany hears about this. Germany is in an alliance with Austria-Hungary, and they're like, well, we better invade because France may also come to the aid of Serbia, and we need to prevent that. So when when Germany attacked France and Belgium, Great Britain came to the defense of their friends. So you can see how this is a chain of events simply based on agreements. Nothing else was done to these countries except a violation of except for honoring their agreement to help defend their friends of other countries in the event of a war. So both sides believed that the war would be over before the end of the year. So they were all wrong. This ends up lasting over 4 years. That's why 17 million people were killed. Okay, so I'm going to switch over and I want to share with you some of the battles that were fought during this war, some of the major battles and some of the major events. So if you have your notes, we're going to switch over to the other sheet. And let's talk about a few of these. In our setting, we, of course, do not have time to go over every specific thing that happened during this war. So we're going to touch on a few. But I want you to take a look at some of the pictures here. And this is really important because this was the first war in history that pictures were available. So when pictures make it back home to the countries that are involved in this war, it really changes the way people viewed war and whether they were supportive or non-supportive of it. On the left, you have a picture here of these living conditions, extremely harsh living conditions. This is one of the better trenches, but I will tell you the trenches were one of the causes of death, not just the war itself. The men were in the trenches for days at a time, where they would literally have to go to the bathroom in the trench, and they would be standing in puddles of urine. And when the temperatures would drop, their feet would freeze because they were so wet from this bacteria-ridden mud. And many of them got gangrene and lost toes, and many of them died from the infections. Another thing that made it a very unsanitary place was there were so many people killed that they were sometimes buried in the walls of the trench itself. So you would be in a trench hiding behind a wall where right a few inches away, a dead body may have been put in the trench. This is, if you look at the picture, the top middle and on the right, a couple new things here. This was an era of new tactic and supplies for warfare that came as a result of the Industrial Revolution. There were better machine guns. They had better helmets. They had better equipment all over. And we're going to talk about this one in the middle here in a minute of a sinking of a ship, and I'll get back to that. Okay, so remember, we've kind of divided the world up in two teams, for lack of better words, that was based on these pre-war alliances. So the Central Powers, well, let me back up a minute and say that there's over 100 battles fought, and we won't be going over everyone. That's just simply too much information. So what I need you to do is more understand the overview of the war. When we talk about theaters or fronts. It's simply the areas of warfare on the map. So the Eastern Front is going to be the eastern side of Europe. The Western Front is going to be on the western side. So the majority of the battles are fought in Europe on the Western Front. So think of the left side of Europe. So those central powers are Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, already gone over that. Russia, Japan, Great Britain, France, and Italy are the allies. In 1917, 3 years into the war, is when the United States joins. I'm getting them all up here so you can have the notes while I talk. So the Western Front, so we have this line drawn here on the map. It borders France, Belgium, and Germany. So the plan, the military plan for the Germany and Austria-Hungary is called the Schlieffen Plan. So Germany has this plan that they're going to quickly go in and conquer France before Russia could go and join the war in that region. So the Germans were actually stopped before they could take Paris. So I think what's important here is to realize that they really thought this was going to be a quick and easy war. And the very first plan ended up not succeeding in the timeline that they had hoped. So basically what they wanted to do was look to their west, go in and take care of the West first. We're gonna cut France out of the equation, and then we'll quickly then regroup, pull all our troops back in, and go to the east, and we will take care of Russia. This just did not happen. They did not anticipate the strength of the French army. And so trench warfare began, and they built thousands of miles of trenches that they would hide in and fight, and it caused a stalemate. It just caused it to be what was turned into what was called a war of attrition, meaning that the war was just stalled. No one was gaining ground either way. They're continuing to fight this war, but they're not ever going past this middle zone between each side's trenches. So some of the longest and deadliest World War I battles were fought in this Western Front because of this trench warfare. Now, the Eastern Front is you go over, and that would be the Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary borders. It's too large of an area for trench warfare. And so we talk about the lines, and they never broke through the lines. That simply means those are areas of concentrated soldiers, troops. That is considered your line. And the Russians were never able to break through the German lines to get to France, where they were going to help their allies. Germany, on the other hand, was never able to take Paris. They kind of get stuck over there. So neither place has the advantage of a full force of resources. They're already divided. That is another reason that caused this stalemate, is everything is divided into sections and no place has 100%. Okay, so let's talk about the Battle of Tannenberg. This is one of the major battles. It's near what is today called Olsztyn, Poland. It was in August of 1914. It is a week-long battle. So look at the amount of troops that were there. Russia has a lot more troops than Germany, but look who loses the most. So you would think Russia should win, but they don't, because they lose so many men in this battle in this week. So the Russian army never enters German lands again over the course of World War I. The Germans proved that they were a strong army that could defeat larger opponents. So Germany, with all the Frederick Williams, Williams Fredericks, and Frederick William II, all of those who had focused so strongly on the military and building that strong army. And I think I even mentioned to you that in addition to having a large number of men in their troops, they really worked on a breeding program of humans so that their soldiers themselves were taller and larger than the rest of the people in the world at that time on average. So they had built a super strong army, and the size of land that they had that was known as Germany did not make them weaker because Russia had more land mass. Getting all of my points here. All right, so the first Battle of Marne, this is in September of 1914. It's about 30 miles northeast of Paris. France and Great Britain have combined forces and have 1 million troops. But still, look at Germany. They still outnumber them with troops. But what really matters here are the number of casualties. And this ends up being a win for the Allies. Great Britain and France are victorious over Germany. Remember, Germany has been victorious over Russia. And this is another outcome of them underestimating how quickly they could take France. So Paris was safe from Germany. Germany was forced to retreat and dig the trenches because of this battle. This is the start of the trench warfare, that war of attrition that would literally last 4 years. And again, this is one of the reasons that the death count was so high, was the living conditions that the men were forced to live in and the lack of sanitation and medical care when they were injured. Germany would now have to fight the war on both fronts. So their force is now divided. They were not able to complete the Schlieffen plan of going west, finishing, going east, and conquering. Okay, the Battle of Somme. Look at the length of time of this battle. So it's hard to imagine calling this a battle per se, as more of a area that just had constant warfare from July to November of 1916. This is near the Somme River in northeast France. It is the bloodiest battle. One part of that reason is because the length of it. But over 1.2 million men were killed in this battle. And it actually never had a clearly defined winner. Nobody was able to come in and declare this a victory and take this region. It was simply a horrifying, massive death toll that just lingered on with no side ever gaining any real ground. So let me get all this up here. A lot of people consider this battle a complete failure, and you can make a really good case for that because it's just a senseless waste of life here. But Great Britain bombarded Germany with over 1.6 million shells for 8 straight days. Germany knew of this plan and took shelter. The British soldiers then marched into what was referred to as the no man's land. So no man's land is the area between each side's trenches. So basically you've got the Allies have got their trenches and we're facing the enemy and they've got their trenches. But those trenches aren't like butted up together. There's a big area of land in the middle. Well, I mean, most certainly if someone wanders up into no man's land, you're going to get shot by somebody in one of the trenches. So it was one of the things that kept both sides from ever acquiring any new ground. But the British soldiers decided to, as a group, march into the no man's land. Over 60,000 were gunned down. So if you think back to that very first picture up at the top, and I said there's some new technologies, but it's also a picture of soldiers just going out into an open field. And on the other side of that open field is a trench full of armed enemies just sitting there to gun them down. It was the single worst day in casualties in British military history. So if you look at the death toll here for these few months, it is extremely high for any war. That is a massive amount of soldiers who were killed for literally no reason. The Allies end up gaining, just because they took this chance of going into no man's land, they end up gaining a few miles. But if you think about the continent as a whole, this really isn't gaining anything. It's still pretty much a stalemate. They've been at a stalemate of nothing for 2 years. They go in and lose this massive number of troops to just gain a few miles, which is barely a dent in an entire continent. So there is another battle going on in Verdun. And because this battle was so intense and so long, it did divert some of that pressure off of what was going on in this other area, if you could find a positive here. Get all my stuff here. All right, so I told you I would jump back to the picture of the sinking boat that was on our opening page. So let's talk about the United States at this time. So it's during the time of President Wilson. So if you're going to take U.S. history, there you got one fact ahead that you'll know for next year if you remember it. So they had this stance of neutrality. But everybody knew that it wasn't 100% true neutrality, because the US, even before they enter the war, are sending massive amounts of money and military supplies to help the Allies. Well, the Germans and the Austro-Hungary Empire, the Ottoman Empire, they know that this is occurring. So even though the men are not there in the beginning, the US soldiers are not there, they are by default an ally because they are supporting them financially and with military equipment. So if you wanted to liken that today to what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, and if the US says we are not getting in this fight, we are remaining neutral. Well, by default, we are not technically neutral because we have financially supported Ukraine. Well, this is the similar thing that is going on at this time. And so, of course, Germany knows that this is occurring. And so they began to do things to punish America for supporting the Allies. They sank a ship that the ship was called the Lusitania. It's a British ocean liner. It's got 2,000 civilians on board, and 159 of them are Americans. The Germans sink that with a torpedo that is shot by a U-boat, which is the earliest submarines. About 1,200 people die. 128 of those are Americans. So interestingly enough, they make up a story, you know, that they had intelligence that there were arms in the bottom of the ship. They actually sent a warning, a public warning to Americans not to sail in that area, that everything was free game to them. And they defended these actions, saying they've warned you, this is a war zone, and we have intelligence that there were weapons being stored down in the bottom of the ship. But the world doesn't really buy that from Germany. And so the majority of the world begins to support the cause of the Allies. Again, you can see that parallel of what's going on today. Russia's made some outlandish claims about Ukraine, but the majority of the world supports Ukraine when they see the atrocities that are committed on civilians, non-military people in the country. Another thing happens, and this one is really probably the most bold thing that Germany did that brought the US into the war. And it's something called the Zimmermann Telegram. So in January of 1917, the German Foreign Secretary, his name is Arthur Zimmermann, he sends a secret telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico. So Mexico, the country right across our southern border. He sends them a secret message and says, hey, we want Mexico to be our allies. And if you're our allies, we will help you get back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Those were areas during the Spanish-American War, during the American imperialistic age, where America spread west and took over things. These are grounds that they gained from Mexico. Well, Germany is now saying, hey, Mexico, if you will join us, we will help you get those lands back. There's really a lot more to this, and I don't have time to go into it today, but I will tell you we go into it in detail in American history. But Great Britain is able to intercept and decode this message. So one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning was that World War II is a time of a lot of new wartime technologies. Well, now they have this new technology of sending messages, telegrams, and things that were not ever available before. But they know that these technologies can be intercepted by other countries who also have these technologies. So they begin to make secret codes based on like number codes, and Enigma machines will eventually come out of this, where the codes rotate on a rolling basis so that other countries can't decipher what the messages actually say. But Britain is able to decipher this one and gives this information to President Wilson, who already has Americans that are angry over the sinking of the Lusitania, now has something to present to Congress that, hey, they are trying to pair up with Mexico to invade the United States and take back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Because of that, that was such a bold act that Congress agreed to declare war on Germany. But wait, can you declare war on one country at this time? You actually cannot, because once you declare war on one country, all of their allies are going to instantly declare war on you. So the US joins World War I, really making it more of a true world war. Okay, so oh my goodness, I'm going to pause the recording just for 1 second, guys. I'm sorry about that. It's because one of my PowerPoints is missing down here. So all you guys here, Logan and Kari, just hold with me 1 minute, and I'm going to pull up one more PowerPoint. All right, so I see why it wouldn't pull up. There's a problem with that PowerPoint. So what I'm going to just move forward, because I still have another PowerPoint to show you, but when the United States enters the war, it really turns the tide of the war. I've spoken multiple times here about this war of attrition and being a stalemate because of the trenches. Well, when the United States goes to Europe and has this huge influx of the military, they are able to turn the tide and to, in essence, force Germany to sign an armistice agreement with the Allies. It doesn't even take very long. This infusion of the troops into the Western Front, it depletes the German resources so quickly that in November of 1918, Germany signs an armistice agreement with the Allies. And I'm getting ready to explain this in more detail with my next PowerPoint, but this quickly became referred to as the war to end all wars because it had such a massive amount of destruction and so many people were slaughtered. They really thought that this type of war would never happen ever again. Okay, so let me get on my last PowerPoint. I do have this one. There was one I wanted to add that you don't have notes for, but for some reason it is blocked. And I've always used it, but that's okay. We'll move forward. So when Germany asked for this armistice, they have to go into negotiations for the treaty that will end the war. Okay, so World War I don't really think I need to recap because you have all this in your notes, but just realizing that this is a war between many countries that lasted for about 4 years between the Allied and the Central Powers. It was when the United States enters in as the Allies. So you can look here that this has changed. So what has changed with the Allied powers? Well, originally, you know, the one of the main causes that sparked the war was Russia coming to the defense of Serbia. And now when we look at the Allies, Russia's not even in the war anymore. Very late in the war, like right around the time that the United States starts to things heat up with the United States, Russia goes through a major change in their country and a revolution. The communist revolution begins in Russia. And because of that, Russia gets a new leader and they want to pull out, and they make a separate treaty with Germany to pull out of the war. So each country, so we'd have only two sides to the war, but each country has to have their own separate treaty with the Allied powers because each country is a little bit different in how they participated in the war. So the Treaty of Versailles is not signed until June 28th of 1919. It takes quite a bit for all of everything to be worked out. It is the last treaty to be signed. Remember, they have all these individual treaties that are signed first, and that works out okay because those countries are able to reach agreements that are individual. Now we have this big, huge agreement that officially will mark the end of the World War. So who writes it? Well, of course, there's always a panel. And so the people that come together are the Prime Minister of Britain, which is David Lloyd George, France's Prime Minister, George Clemenceau, and the United States President, which is President Wilson. Who's not invited? The guy from Germany. The Kaiser Wilhelm II, he has very little participation because, as we're getting ready to see, everybody thinks the whole war is his fault to begin with. So there's two schools of thought of what do we need to do in this treaty. No one wants Germany to regain strength because they just assume they'll cause another war. And that was a very good concern because being that we're in the future, we know that they did cause another war. So Clemenceau, he advocates for a very severe punishment for Germany. So we're not just signing a treaty here to end the war. We also want to make sure Germany is punished severely. They had invaded France, they had devastated France in many of the battles. And and France wants Germany punished, not just peace, punished. So Great Britain and United States, they have not been as affected directly as France was by the devastation. And so they really want to focus more on a peace that will end the war, but let's not do too many punishments because that might lead to another war. So they have a different school of thought here. But what ends up in this agreement is that they determine that Germany has to be punished to a certain extent so that they cannot cause another war. Wilson's concerns and proposals are largely ignored. So what's interesting is at this time, Wilson gives speech after speech after speech, promoting the League of Nations, which is the precursor to the United Nations. This league that people join together to promote world peace, and that we will meet together diplomatically to discuss things before war breaks out. Well, all this kind of goes on the wayside because it is so intense right now of the feelings of what Germany has done to the countries in Western Europe. And so they say Germany must accept full blame for causing World War I. So that's easy enough. Just sign a paper. Hey, it was all our fault. But that's not where it ended. They wanted them to pay reparations. So they wanted them to help the countries where they had destroyed property to rebuild that. They have to pay for all those losses and damages that they've caused. So this is really difficult, and it's pretty much, if you think about it logically, an impossible task for Germany. Germany has to finance the rebuilding of their own country. And their economy is very bad at this time. It's a very unstable economy. And to make matters worse, Germany is going to lose all of their colonies. Well, the colonies help their economy. So not only is the economy terrible because of the war and they need to rebuild, we're going to take all that away and you have to pay. And you're going to lose some land. Over 1 million square miles of rich natural resources that would have helped Germany rebuild is taken from Germany and given away. And here's the real clincher here, is they're going to have to reduce their military. So this is the hope of them not preventing a war in the future. They are not allowed to rebuild their army and navy. All war material productions needs to be stopped. And it doesn't say this here, but literally they take away German military things that exist. So the ships are seized, the military equipment is seized to make Germany very weak militarily. So things are taken away from Germany that put them in a very bad economic state. And then they're asked to pay an enormous debt to other countries. So you can see why this kind of is set up to fail. It's an impossible situation. Whoops, sorry about that. The League of Nations continues to be promoted by President Wilson. This is, like I said, a precursor to the UN, where these countries will promise to work together to never have a world war again. Germany is not going to be allowed to join till 1926. So here's the really interesting point, is this is the brainchild of President Woodrow Wilson. It is a United States idea. The president cannot get the support of Congress for the United States to actually join So they never do. It is never approved by Congress. I mean, Congress doesn't even want to sign this treaty. The US believes that the Treaty of Versailles is too harsh on Germany. Congress isn't going to sign it because they feel like you're just setting the world up for the next war. This is just ridiculous. And they refuse to ratify the treaty and refuse to accept responsibility for setting the world up for another war. Germany suffers greatly as a result of this. So the German leadership did really cause a massive amount of devastation in World War I. They are the reason that the United States was brought into the war. Their unrestricted U-boat torpedo warfare caused a lot of death in the civilian population. But there's also, now we have this country of German people that have to exist in the world. And how do we make this possible? So the representatives from Germany are very reluctant to sign this treaty because they know it is a completely impossible situation. Germans hold protest for their country not to sign this because they know what's going to happen to them. Their economy continues to get worse, and they become more and more isolated by the rest of the world. The Treaty of Versailles brings a peace to the world in the fact that the actual act of war does cease, but it sets into motion a whole new set of chain of events that will lead to World War II. I think, okay, so I'm just going to stay here for a second because there's a few things that I want to tell you about this. So in Germany, what is going on at this time is their economy collapses so quickly that their dollar, or the equivalent of their dollar, I think of that as just a piece of money, the mark, the Reichmark, it becomes so valueless that employers begin to have to pay their employees up to 4 times every day just to keep up with the rate of inflation. So what is inflation? What does that actually mean? Because we are experiencing that right now in our world. So I'm going to try to explain this very briefly, so this will help you understand what happened and what it means today. When a country decides to develop an economy and a money system, that money system should be based on precious metals, gold and silver. And so each country has an amount of gold and silver that is the wealth of that nation. For example, we have Fort Knox, which I'm sure you've heard of, where our nation has a stash of gold and silver that are precious metals. So it becomes over time literally impossible for world or country economies and trade to occur with just pieces of this gold and silver. And so the money system is developed where, I'm going to use the word dollars because that's just basically what we refer to it in America, but other countries have these same things, these pieces of paper that are literally IOUs for a chunk of that precious metal. So that piece of paper is a representation for a piece of that metal or the country's wealth as a whole. So if you have this set amount of wealth, the less pieces of paper that are printed, the more chunk of that wealth that piece of paper is valued for. So if you begin to print more and more pieces of paper, the chunk of wealth that they represent becomes less and less. So that is a good indication to explain what inflation is today. In America, when politicians run for office, they promise all of these programs and things that they're going to instill when they come into office. And a lot of times they'll say no new taxes. So in order to pay for all the stuff that politicians promise, they have to print more money. So each piece of money that you have is worth a little bit less and less and less of a value of that nation's wealth. When that happens, that's called inflation. And so when trade occurs, people who are selling products want more of those pieces of paper for their products because they know that the piece of paper represents a smaller chunk of value. So now let's jump back to World War I. So not only does Germany need money, but a lot of their nation's wealth is being taken away at a very rapid rate. And when that occurs, the amount of value that their marks are worth becomes less and less and less. It is so extreme that at the beginning of the war, if we're just saying dollar as an example, a loaf of bread, if it were $1, during this time after the World War I, when Germany is literally falling apart, a loaf of bread would have been over $1 billion. That is how much inflation was occurring in Germany at that time. And there comes a point where Germany's money system becomes so valueless that they just scratch it. They just decide we need a new leader. We need a new form of money. So what has happened because of the Treaty of Versailles is they have set Germany up to not only be hated by the rest of the world, but for Germany itself to hate the rest of the world for doing this to their people. They are literally starving and they have no way to get out of this hole. So the United States, who won't enter this League of Nations, actually becomes one of the reasons that Germany's economy begins to turn. I can't think of the man's name, but there is a campaign in America for businessmen to go and invest in Germany and to put American dollars into Germany after World War I. So this is the situation I'm trying to set up for you, because World War II doesn't happen instantly. When we have class next Tuesday, we're going to talk about the time in the world where there is a rise of dictators. And what has happened is at the end of this war, this treaty was pounded out almost in a lack of forethought measure. So it leaves the Central Power countries in such a devastated state that we're literally opening the doors for dictators to come in and offer a way to take over and bring these countries out of these horrible states of inflation, starvation, and devastation. So I'm going to end here for today. And I know that I talked really quickly, but I'm going to not only post this video, but I will post the PowerPoints I used, because these little videos that are embedded into the PowerPoints, well, I mean, I know not everybody is a big history nerd like your history teacher, but they are super, super informative, of just giving you more information to helping you understand what happens in the course of history. So thank you, Logan and Kari, for joining me today, and I hope everyone else will watch the video, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.